Welcome, everybody. I am Cole Harrison, Executive Director of Massachusetts Peace Action. I want to welcome you to another Mass Peace Action webinar. The problem of international relations and militarism is extremely complicated, and it's absolutely central to the concerns of the peace movement. And I think you will find tonight's presentation extremely stimulating as we seek for the ultimate causes underneath the problems we're trying to combat. And Professor Harry Targ has not only a unique analysis, but some interesting proposals for solutions or steps we can take. Harry Targ is a emeritus professor of political science from Purdue University. He is a longtime activist, currently a co-chair of the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism. And he's also a member of the steering committee of Wisconsin Peace Action. And he blogs at heartlandradical.blogspot.com. And if you get on Harry's list, he will send you these snippets periodically with like bite-sized ideas that just focus in on one thing and are easy to read and easy to get started thinking about. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Harry Targ.
Okay, let's see if I can get my.
And we will have a Q&A after his presentation, I should have said.
Yeah, it's clear. Yeah, it's clear. I'm gonna go make the corn now, okay? Why not?
For some reason, it's not filling the whole screen.
Well, you have to go into presentation mode in PowerPoint.
Screen sharing, stop share. Oh, I'm doing something wrong.
No, I think if you,
Okay.
I think you got it, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for attending. Welcome on this Valentine's Day evening for a discussion of the military-industrial complex and imperialism. I know for the most part, I'm preaching to the choir, but hopefully some of my narrative will help us think about ways in which to more systematically put together the ideas and perspectives that most of us share. So I've put together a PowerPoint with some text that I want to refer to that illustrates my concerns and our collective concerns. The first is the issue of war. By any measure of the pain and suffering that the 21st century imperialism is staggering. Millions of people, mostly in the Middle East and South Asia, have died or been displaced by war on terrorism, which was initiated in 2001. And these figures include untold thousands who have died directly from war and violence in Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, and elsewhere in the Middle East, South Asia, and North Africa, and currently through hybrid wars that I'll make brief reference to. And the hybrid war doctrine is particularly applicable to examining US policy towards Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, and indeed Afghanistan as well. Here are some findings from the Cost of War Project of the violence caused by war and the human suffering caused by war since 9/11. Cost of War Project estimated that 387,000 civilians have been killed as a result of fighting, and 38 million have become war refugees and displaced persons. And the US has spent about $8 trillion since 9/11. and the US government is conducting counterterrorism activities in 85 countries. The issues that I want to address tonight vis-a-vis these has to do what is the nature of the US military budget today, what is the history of militarism, what Seymour Melman called the permanent war economy. And you'll see one of my arguments is that the idea of the permanent war economy, or what Eisenhower called the military industrial complex, is one set of causal explanations for US militarism. And further, I'd like to talk about the connections between the military industrial complex and the global needs of capitalism. And you'll see I'm trying to argue that there's a parallelism and mutual causality of the idea of a permanent war economy and also the needs of capitalism to expand on a worldwide basis. Also, I want to ask, what are the current sources of international tensions, particularly the new Cold War, and what's behind US policy? And we might, if I don't talk too long, speculate about what's behind US policy in Ukraine. Very puzzling to me. And I want to add a little bit to our conversation about what a NATO journal referred to as cognitive war, an interesting new conceptualization, although its roots are very old. And then finally, to ask ourselves the question, what does the peace movement do in response to militarism and imperialism today? First, this slide shows you what we all know, that US military expenditures are roughly equivalent to the 10x military expenditures in countries, so that you could see that the United States spends 3 times more than China, I think 10 times more than the Soviet Union, and so on. So one could say roughly the
Soviet Union.
Yeah, the United States spends roughly half the military expenditures of the world. In 2022, as we all know, the Congress passed, with the endorsement of the Biden administration, of a military budget of $778 billion. And the measure provided significant increases for initiatives intended to counter China, bolster Ukraine, and procure new aircrafts and ships, underscoring a bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill. One source, I think Nick Turtz, has pointed out that there are military contractors with investments in 430 of the 435 congressional districts. If one looks at military expenditures compared with the Biden proposal for Build Back Better, the original proposal of BBB was for $3.5 trillion in expenditures over a 10-year period of time. Comparably, over a 10-year period of time, the Pentagon projected budget would be $7.5 trillion. I may have said 3.5 billion, 3.5 trillion for BBB and 7.5 trillion over 10 years for the Pentagon. And here is an article that I referred to in Market Watch that made reference to this comparison of spending for the military compared with Build Back America. In addition, the spending on contractors continues today at the same rapid clip, accounting for more than half of average Pentagon spending each year. And with Congress poised, as one author related, to approve the $778 billion one-year spending package for the military, the contractors stand to gain again. Democrats are slashing the Build Back Better bill from $3.5 trillion to $1.75 trillion over 10 years. Meanwhile, Pentagon contractors have received $3.4 trillion over the last decade. Here's an image of the magazine Private Military Contractor, in case any of you are interested in applying for a position. And I had occasion to look further at military contractors and wrote on one of my blogs an interesting sidebar to the current Afghanistan story. And this was written before the US withdrew its troops from Afghanistan, compared the formal military troops, which then the spring of 2021 totaled 2,500, with a much larger component of private contractors. A Congressional Research Service report issued on February 22nd, 2021, indicated that during the fourth quarter of 2020, there were some 43,000 defense contractors working in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, 27,000 plus of whom were in Afghanistan. And from fiscal year 2011 to 2019, Defense Department contracts for services performed in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan cost about $187 billion. And contractors are civilians working for the military. And when I began to look at the Congressional Committee recommendation that the United States not withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, I found this report, which was a report subsidized by the United States Congress, and it had an incredible array of data on private defense contractors working along with US military personnel around the world, and opened my eyes to the realization that US military presence around the world is not solely armed soldiers, but lots of civilian contractors. The last thing I would talk about in reference to the basic military budget is equivalencies. And we've seen literature over the years, going back to the 80s at least, comparing dollars spent in the military with dollars spent in any number of non-military activities, education, environmentally, healthcare, and so on. And everybody argues that military spending is not a job creator compared with virtually any other activity that people would engage in to earn a living. So, and in some scholars have referred to military spending as a job destroyer when we think about the alternatives that were for which the money could be used. I look at two bodies of literature that overlap, but I think are a little bit different in explaining this militarization. The one I refer to is theorizing about a permanent war economy, and the other refers to classical imperialism, linking capitalism to militarization and overseas activity. In reference to the first, the permanent war economy, if we look back to the end of World War II, the United States, by virtue of a whole number of things, was in a position of economic and military hegemony. Of course, partially because the Soviet Union lost 27 million of its citizens in taking on the German war machine. Inside the Truman administration, towards post-war policy was being discussed, and one line of argument was that the reality of the revitalization of the US economy, say compared with the 1930s, involved the establishment and of necessity of military mobilization. In other words, there was a connection between economic growth and development and high levels of military expenditures. And writers like Andrew Bacevich and before him Seymour Melman referred to the idea of building a permanent war economy. A permanent war economy is an economy based upon a partnership between government, the corporate sector, and the military. Of course, its ideological justification was external threat. And of course, diplomatic historians point out that when President Truman went before Congress in the spring of '47 to ask for a modest $400 million to provide support for the Greek government fighting against rebels, he was told by a Republican Senator Vandenberg, "We'll support you, but you better scare hell out of the American people." And he did. He raised the specter of international communism. So the permanent war economy needs an enemy, an other, a vehicle for scaring people into supporting continued and expanding military expenditures. In 1950, with one, the onset of the Korean War, two, with the Soviets having detonated their own atomic bomb, inside the Truman administration, a report was circulated called National Security Council Document Number 68. It was written by Paul Nitze and Dean Acheson. And it recommended that the United States double its military budgets for the 1950s over the late 1940s. But most importantly, it recommended that American policy should be based upon the primacy of spending as much as is needed for defense, for the military. And quite literally, the report said every time a president sits down to sign off on a federal budget for the coming year, military priorities need to be number one. So satisfy all the needs of the military before thinking about any other functions of government, education, healthcare, transportation, roads, and so on. And as a result of that, between 1947 and 1990, the permanent war economy cost the American people close to $9 trillion and nearly 100,000 US citizens killed during this period. And about 10 million people around the world died directly or indirectly because of US military policies. So the money was forthcoming, an activist in global foreign policy was forthcoming. And this school of thought would argue that all of this was driven in large part by the vision of maintaining a permanent war economy and the presupposition that the maintenance of the US economic system required a permanent war economy. And here is an illustration, if you have access to the slides, the top 5 Yemen war profiteers. And these are companies that have made enormous profits for selling military equipment to Saudi Arabia to bomb and slaughter the people of Yemen. And these are names familiar to all of us: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and General Electric. On imperialism, probably we're all familiar with the basic propositions of Lenin in his essay on imperialism, that capitalism over time, that is a system in which there's a qualitative transformation from a multiplicity of semi-autonomous economic actors to the emergence of monopolies. The concentration of production and capital developed to such a high stage that they create monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. The data on economic concentration in the US in the 20th century bears this out. Secondly, Lenin argued, you remember, that the merging of bank capital with industrial capital created on the basis of this finance capital, or a financial oligarchy. Third, he pointed out that, therefore, that the export of capital becomes extremely important, as distinguished from merely the export of commodities. And fourth, the formation of international capitalist monopolies would share the world among themselves. And you thus have the territorial division of the whole world in a system in which there's a multiplicity of independent economic actors. And of course, that has changed after World War II into a bipolar world. People who were writing from the tradition of the global South introduced dependency theory as an amendment to Lenin's theory. Many of these writers, like Samir Amin, Andre Gunnar Frank, Antonio dos Santos, pointed out that while Lenin was largely right about the economic dynamics in the powerful countries, the Leninist theory of imperialism did not give adequate attention to the victims, if you will, of imperialism. And so dependency theory was a body of social science theories predicated on the notion that resources flow from, quote, a periphery of poor and underdeveloped states to a core of wealthy states, enriching the latter at the expense of the former. It's a central contention of dependency theory that poor states are impoverished and rich ones enriched by the way poor states are integrated into the world system. Andre Gunnar Frank, in one of the earlier works from this point of view, talked about the development of underdevelopment. That is to say, in the 15th century, there was a rough equality of economic circumstances all across the globe, and Europe developed and the global South underdeveloped. So that what you have is an image of imperialism that illustrates the inextricable connection between expansionism, financial capital, and global expansion, and underdevelopment in the global South. Dependency theory went on to argue that there are oftentimes core elites in countries of the global South whose interests and perspective align them with the global North. Though these leaders of selected countries become sort of intermediaries in the process of imperialism and domination. But what's important about this theory also is it suggests the potential and motivation and understanding of resistance from the global South. Most of the violence that I talked about at the outset was a violence targeted against peoples from the global South. And dependency theory suggests why such violence from the global North to the South occurs, and why resistance and efforts at revolutionary change to overthrow this system of dominance and dependence would occur. Beginning in the late 1960s, we begin to see a declining in global hegemony, particularly of the United States. I refer to the period between the 1940s, the end of World War II, and the 1960s as the kind of the golden age of American capitalism. But it began to decline. It began to experience intercapitalist competition. European and Japanese economic systems were challenging the dominance of the US. American firms were experiencing declining rates of profit. There was a pattern of overproduction and underconsumption. Inside the US, there was a kind of, as James O'Connor calls it, a fiscal crisis of the state. The demands on the state from labor and other sectors could not be fulfilled by the accumulation of capital at the state level. And we saw the radical decolonization of the global South and demands by leaders from the global South for a new international economic order. To respond to these challenges to US and European capitalism, there emerged neoliberal globalization, deindustrialization in the core, moving production in the periphery where products could be produced more cheaply, shifting the global South from economies based on producing for their own needs to economies based on exporting cheap products to the global North, the debt crisis, the promotion of free trade, and so on. And so what you have is the beginnings of a substantial crisis of global capitalism, if you will. And among its byproducts are the rising resistance from the global South, as illustrated by Arab Spring, revolutionary ferment in Latin America, in Asia, and in the 21st century, the so-called pink tide in Latin America. And at the same time, the rise of China and Russia as economic actors who increasingly network with the countries of the global South. So the political economy of international relations becomes more complex, and perhaps that is one source of the increasing militarization of US foreign policy. If we look very briefly at techniques of imperialism in the 21st century, I have a modest list here. Global presence. Mark Pilasek and Chalmers Johnson and a whole host of others estimate that the U.S. has roughly 800 U.S. military installations in more than 40 countries. Privatization of the U.S. military. We refer back to the contractors that I talked about earlier, when there aren't necessarily boots on the ground, there are private contractors advising governments on how to defend themselves against rebellion. There was an article I saw today on private contractors advising governments and movements in Africa to overthrow and oppose radical transformations of African countries. We see the emergence of new technologies, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones. Nick Turse in the complex, How the Military Invades Our Everyday Lives, and it's a very good book for a lot of reasons, discusses the introduction of unmanned aerial weapons in the 1990s and their current weaponry of choice for the White House. We don't have to worry about boots on the ground. We could kill adversaries with drones. Assassinations, and there's some data to suggest that agencies of the U.S. covertly engage in assassinations. In addition, missionary humanitarian interventions. While most techniques of empire use direct violence, what missionary humanitarian institutions do is to try and influence, penetrate, and affect societies under the aegis of humanitarianism, so-called NGOs. And finally, scholars in recent years have begun to talk about hybrid wars. The tactics of hybrid war prioritize identifying strategic weaknesses in target states. These do not necessarily prioritize targeting roads, bridges, or power plants for destruction, but rather economic, political, ethnic, or other vulnerabilities. I have a longer description here, but one significant feature of hybrid war strategies is to essentially economically blockade people and nations, and to increase pain and suffering so that these people come to the view that they have to overthrow their own governments. The embargo of Cuba, which has gone on 60 years now, embargoes in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, and I read someplace that the US has policies of embargoing against 39 different countries. So this is hybrid war. It's not boots on the ground. It's not direct violence. It's not shooting or killing people, but in fact, it is starving people. And my friends in Wisconsin have been protesting American policy towards Afghanistan. And on reflection, the US withdrew its troops, but now is engaged in policies to starve the Afghan people. That's an example of hybrid war. Why is the US preparing for a new Cold War? It's another question related to the others that I've laid out already. Let me just name a few and then move on to near the end. First, as Alfred McCoy has pointed out in his book on the collapse of the American century, the rise and decline of US global power, the United States, relatively speaking, is a declining imperial power, declining economically, comparatively speaking. And therefore, McCoy argues the United States is embarking on a path to overcoming its declining relative economic hegemony by increasingly investing in military advances, a space force, a new generation of nuclear weapons, cybersecurity, biometrics, maintaining and enhancing a global military presence, particularly in the Pacific. So a new Cold War with China, and indeed Russia, is in part the result of desperate efforts to overcome US declining power, and incidentally to not willing to accept the possibility of a multipolar world. Secondly, as Vijay Prashad has pointed out, the US is desperately seeking to overcome its declining monopoly on technological advances. Third, while the US is engaged in efforts at regime change around the world and is using brutal economic sanctions to starve people into submission, such as Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and other countries, China is increasing its economic ties to these countries through investments, trade, and assistance. Fourth, the new Cold War rationalizes big increases in military spending. And finally, it may be of some relevance, a new Cold War, it is hoped, will increase support for an administration that is experiencing declining support in domestic policy. The last variant of war, if you will, that I want to make reference to is so-called cognitive war. I had occasion to find an article in a NATO journal that discusses cognitive war. And cognitive war, as this article says, is a result of the fact that the human mind becomes the battlefield. The aim is to change not only what people think, but how they think and act. Waged successfully, it shapes and influences individual and group beliefs and behaviors to favor an aggressor's tactical or strategic objectives. Now, the authors of this article, I think, were trying to explain the behavior of and the tactics of Russia. But what resonated for me as I watch and listen to CNN every day and most of the other corporate media is that this cognitive warfare is being carried out in such a way to convince us of the dire necessity of militarization in Ukraine and in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So what does all this mean for the peace movement? Well, I just make some general points. We ought to see the parallelism and mutuality of causation of a thesis about a permanent war economy and a thesis about capitalist imperialism. It's not one or the other, but it's both, and they're inextricably connected. Secondly, as the connection between, as we look at comparisons between BBB and military spending, we ought to see that there are fundamental interconnections between the various concerns that many of us have and are working on, whether they be healthcare, education, the environment, and military spending. And one of my frustrations is there's a tendency for all of us to silo our interest in activities and not adequately develop analyses that connect the various issues. So what we need to do, in my judgment, is to generate ideas and activities that connect peace, anti-militarism, and domestic issues. Here's a nice visual: end war abroad and violence against people at home. Just as I was writing this up, I added a couple appendices. First, in terms of the idea of cognitive warfare, there are certain intrinsic ideas, concepts that I know I found in the classroom and most students accepted, but they're concepts that are generally accepted uncritically in corporate media and public discussions of international relations. One, the inevitability, permanence of a state system. That is, that we all assume that inevitably the world was, and in the future will be organized around individual nation states. Two, there's a mythology about something called the national interest. And this covers up the fact that it may not be in our national interest to encourage and support war in Ukraine, whereas it might be in the national interest of Raytheon and other corporations to make such war. Three, security is a buzzword that doesn't lend itself to much reflection. Four, what's become a common trope nowadays is that the world is made up of democracies and authoritarian regimes. That is assumed without reflection. Fifth, the idea of American exceptionalism. And this idea has found voice from Teddy Roosevelt to President Obama to President Biden. The United States is the exceptional, critical nation in world affairs, the indispensable nation, and that's never challenged. Sixth, there will always be wars, and consequently, seven, we need to be prepared for the wars of the 21st century. I recently retired from an R1 university that has an extensive program in engineering and science, and they've gotten enormously profitable defense contracts in the last few years. And part of their rationale for the research and development at the university is that we're going to help contribute to the preparation of the United States with 21st century wars. And finally, of less visibility, but perhaps of continued importance, is the implicit assumption of the superiority of the white race. I had occasion years ago to write a paper on Teddy Roosevelt and US policy around the time of the Spanish-American War. And I discovered that Roosevelt, in a major talk, declared unabashedly, unembarrassedly that Western civilization has contributed to humankind, and i.e. the white race has made a major contribution to history. That's implied in so much of our discourse. How are these cognitive warfare messages disseminated? Well, here's the whole discussion of the media consolidation. Small numbers of financial speculators are buying out print media. Those who own or control electronic media are smaller and smaller. And the issue of the dissemination of cognitive warfare through educational institutions is becoming increasingly important. The battle for ideas and what is to be taught K through 12 and in higher education. On cognitive warfare, I found an article 2 days ago in the New York Times with the title, "U.S. Battles Putin by Disclosing His Next Possible Moves." And this article points out that it's the strategy of the Biden administration to articulate claims and make predictions about Russia's next moves, in almost every case personifying Russia as Putin making these moves. And it got me to thinking about the idea of cognitive war, that they are using this kind of narrative to try and pressure Putin, on the one hand, to pressure Putin to not engage in physical aggressive action against Ukraine, and secondly, to convince the American people that war is imminent and the U.S. response of some sort is necessary. Here's reference to a link to a short blog that I did with the title something like "The U.S. is preparing for war, lies again," and I refer to the Gulf of Tonkin incidents and the discussion of weapons of mass destruction in the case of Iraq. Here is a vivid imagery of this idea of cognitive warfare and the role of ideology. Malcolm X warned that the media is the most powerful entity on earth, and they have the power to make the innocent guilty and make the guilty innocent. And that's power, because they control the minds of the masses. The press is so powerful in its image-making tool. It can make the criminal look like he's the victim and make the victim look like he's the criminal. So there's two lines of argument that I want to end with. One has to do with this idea of organizing, networking, connecting issues of war and peace and militarism to the domestic needs of the American people. And I commend you to this very interesting flyer, which you could probably find Googling as much as easily as I did. The Poor People's Campaign, a moral budget versus a war budget. And it articulates front and back, it's a nice flyer to distribute, what would be the consequences of spending money for the Build Back Better Act versus National Defense Authorization Act. And you could look at the different impacts. Just for example, the Build Back Better Act would reduce poverty and economic insecurity through fully refundable tax credit that reach the poorest households. On the other side, National Defense Authorization Act prioritized military force over diplomacy by funding $15 for the military for every $1 for diplomacy and not non-military aid. And what the flyer does for both sides, front and back, is to make comparative statements about the impact of spending the non-military sectors versus spending in military sectors. So one of the arguments I would make is that we in the peace movement need to connect with and convince our comrades working on healthcare, education, the environment, that we're all in this together. And there's an inextricable interconnection between domestic and military issues, that a potential war on Ukraine will have negative consequences for us as well as the Ukrainian people. And finally, the battle of ideas, cognitive warfare. We're falling behind. And here's a wonderful image of Fidel Castro, who says, just ideas have greater power than all the reactionary forces put together. The world will be conquered by ideas, not by force whose power to subdue and dominate humanity will become ever more diminished. So just ideas have greater power than all the reactionary forces put together. And perhaps that combination of renewed organizing, networking with our comrades and other social movements, and more rigorously combating the cognitive warfare that is being used against us, as well as the people around the world, are the ways that we have to proceed. So I'd be interested in your comments and additions. I'm sorry I went on so long. Cole is muted.
Oh, boy. Thank you, Harry. That was a great talk. I'm just going to give you an action step if you have a minute while you prepare your questions. But please indicate that you want to ask a question by using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and then raise hand. So I will call on people who raise their hand first. You could also write your question in the chat, but I'll give preference to people who have raised their hand so they can ask the question themselves. Here's a little action page that you can send a message to decision makers about Ukraine. I better put this link in the chat too, hadn't I? This will contact both people in the administration and Congress to not send military aid to Ukraine, to not threaten sanctions on Russia ahead of time, but to wait and see what Russia does. And to require, there's a war powers letter to require Congress to approve any use of military forces against Russia. This letter just came out on Friday in Congress. So go ahead and fill that out, and you will send a message to 8 different decision makers, your two senators, your congressman, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of defense. And now, let's see how we're doing on questions. I better take this down. Okay, first up is going to be Richard Wright. Please unmute.
So fast on the button. Thank you, Harry, for your presentation. It was very good.
Oh, thank you.
It was a good survey, I will say. I had 2 things I wanted to suggest. One is I sent a private message to Cole. I'd be interested to know what the distribution of the participants are on this by geography. I think that's may actually become very important. But okay, I'll just leave it at that. The other question or comment that I wanted to point out is you mentioned the NATO as far as cognitive warfare. You don't have to go to a NATO paper. The mass peace action. A lot of this finds its impetus in Gene Sharp. And Gene Sharp, who is a professor at MIT, has an institute, I think it's in Newton, Massachusetts, in which he lays out all of this stuff, how you appropriate cultural icons for use in propaganda, how you organize people, through various tactics, and I would just suggest that you might want to look into that, for future reference. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Just say that Gene Sharp is deceased, but we're a state peace group in Massachusetts. Wisconsin also co-sponsored, so we probably have more audience disproportional in Massachusetts. But in the last 2 years, since we've been doing everything online, we've gotten a lot of supporters in different parts of the country and the world, so it might be mixed. Harry, you want to take that?
No, thanks, Richard. I appreciate your comments. I'm familiar with, I used to teach in peace studies, and I know Gene Sharp has developed a comprehensive list of nonviolent protest actions that I want to revisit. I wasn't aware of this other list that you mentioned, and I think I will look at that.
Okay, next up is Cliff Durant.
All my old friends.
Please unmute, Cliff.
Okay. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we
All right.
hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I would like to kind of turn the question of, why does the U.S. follow imperialist policies into an economic question. How can it do that? Huge amounts of money are spent on the military and the wars abroad. And it seems to me that we can understand how it's able to do that by considering the fact that there is a crisis of overaccumulation that has afflicted capitalism now for some years. There's just too much wealth to know what to do with it. And so one way is by spending it on the military, blowing it up, conducting wars, so that you could see wars as being economically necessary to sustain capitalism during this crisis of overaccumulation.
What do you say, Harry?
I think it's what Cliff says is very interesting, and I want to reflect on it more. If you go back, right, Cliff, to Baron and Sweezy, Monopoly Capital, the problem that the capitalist crisis was excess surplus. And I think he mentioned the desirability of having military expenditures and also advertising and, in a sense, antisocial ways to spend money to maintain the vitality of capitalism. So, you know, if I'm not mistaken, what you're saying is close to the Sweezy thesis about militarism.
Yeah, and actually, if you think about it, it's very much in line with David Harvey's analysis of how capitalism has moved from one crisis, finding a solution to that, and then that solution giving rise to a new crisis. Consider, for example, his discussion of the rebuilding of Paris as a way of using surplus. And it seems to me that U.S. has found in its military adventures a new way of doing that.
Yeah, good.
I'm going to piggyback on the question, if I may. Harry, I thought you were setting up a distinction between theorists who say that the military is parasitic on the U.S. economy, and those who say that the U.S. imperialism actually needs a strong military to compete with its foes, particularly as we enter the multipolar era. So which is it? Is it, or is it, what's the ratio of causality? Why does the U.S. have such a powerful military? Why does it need it?
Let's see.
I mean, you spoke to this. I just wanted you to see if we could sharpen it.
One, to writers from Seymour Melman, well, C. Wright Mills, Seymour Melman, Nick Turse, William Hartung, I think some of the people who've been on webinars that you've sponsored, right, point to the magnitude of economic power and influence of a selected number of corporations that have the capacity and perhaps the necessity of influencing the allocation of national resources in their direction, so that their dynamic is their own material interests. The Raytheons and General Electrics and Lockheed Martin and so on and so forth. At the same time, it seems to me that American capitalism is experiencing or experiences episodically resistance to trade and investment and extraction of natural resources. And so that the military becomes a necessity to put down revolutionary ferment. And to some degree then, the military-industrial complex and the needs of capitalism to crush resistance become parallel and mutually reinforcing. I don't know if that clarifies.
Okay, more people are entering the question queue. Stephen David, please.
Hi, everyone. Harry, thanks for a very comprehensive and, look at American imperialism and what we face today and tomorrow. I just wanted to add that, in looking at financing the imperial war, we've looked at, $8 trillion of the United States budgets for that. But I also want to add, in a sense, that all NATO countries have been spending. Trump's insistence when he came into office was European countries should, to carry their weight, and got around to, them also putting in money. I think when we add the excessive budgets on all European countries or Western countries, in fact, in prosecuting this war, we sometimes err in just looking at the United States and Americans involved in this. And even when we look at, the kind of military contractors, these people come from all over the world, the Australians, the ex-South Africans that have got out of the armies are all involved in, as contractors everywhere. So I think that that the struggle and the analysis, ought to open up a little bit further and involve the whole Western imperial project. It's not just an American project. It's led by the Americans, but it's far greater than that. And then the second point I wanted to point out is, in cognitive wars, the thing that separates us from, the second, at least the amendments, constitutional amendments that gives you, freedom of speech is this article, you sent me the article to read on cognitive wars, and it specifically talks about the ways in looking specifically at the enemies within society. That is the intellectuals, anybody that speaks out at war, the kind of analysis, or anybody that organizes protests and so forth. So this is a far serious kind of matter. It's not just, the cognitive wars, not just simply a matter of propaganda, usual war propaganda. This is targeting people within the country as well, as to change the status from citizens to enemies, within the state. And this is how serious that this development is. Just those 2 points. Thanks.
I think they're both important. Near the end, I had that appendix where I listed concepts that it seems to me that are part of cognitive warfare. And I just sort of off the top of my head, thought of concepts that I think I grew up with. There'll always be wars. That's one that's deeply held among people. And these deeply held concepts and superiority of the white race is another one. These deeply held concepts have to be fought against and challenged because they provide the bedrock for popular support for militarism. And so I think it's terribly important. And the right wing knows that, right? So they don't want students to be exposed to, quote, critical race theory, for example, or they only want students to learn about the vitality and exuberance and virtue of American political institutions. So it's a battle of the consciousness of people, and I think that's terribly important.
Right. Thank you. Okay, next up is Michael Brackney. Michael.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Great. Harry, thanks very much for that presentation, and especially for your last remark about concepts you grew up with, because I grew up with those same doggone concepts. I really hear that. And one of the concepts that struck me recently is just that democracy is really our code word for capitalism, and more particularly for American imperialism. I think of the expression that Woodrow Wilson used in the First World War to make the world safe for democracy. And of course, he wasn't really talking about democracy at all. And I'm wondering if you know how far the use of democracy goes back in our history. I don't know enough about American history to know when that actually when originated. And I'm wondering if you do, or anybody else here.
If there's someone else could help. I had occasion at my former university, the Board of Trustees and the president declared that we were, all students were going to have to satisfy a civic literacy requirement, which meant another course or test or going to hear a number of speakers. And many of us asked the question of where did this come from? And we found by looking far back enough that it went to ideas that were originated in ALEC, ACTA, the various Koch Foundation institutions that were concerned about the fact that young people were not learning enough about the virtues of American political institutions. So I wrote about that, and then I did what you're asking. I Googled democracy, and I found that a professor of political science at University of Iowa did a survey, sort of accumulated documents that at least go back to the 1920s, if not earlier, to see how people define democracy. And he found 5 different core conceptions of democracy, none of them related to what my former university wanted people to learn in civic literacy. But I don't know, I don't know enough history to know if the idea begins to surface in the 19th century, the extent to which all of these ideas come from Greek philosophy in the West, in the West at the, dawn of the millennium or whatever. So I don't really have an answer. But I think when we think of democracy, we think of 2 political parties, right? And that people going to pull the lever every 2 years or every 4 years. And that's democracy. And if a country like Cuba doesn't have 2 political parties, well, they're just not a democracy.
Thank you.
I'll just interject. I'm not a historian, but in the contention between Jefferson and Adams, Jefferson's party was called the Democratic Party. So at least the term was in common usage then for one political philosophy.
Yeah.
Let's go to Alana Hartzog. Alana, please unmute.
Thank you so much. And Harry, that was excellent. Just to follow on the democracy of Evangelos Valianatos. He's a Greek American, and he's written about roots of democracy as being in the small farmers of Greece. It was studying how the small farmers communicated and organized and made decisions. It did not spring out of the philosophers' brains, but from the small farmers. So it there connects democracy with economic democracy, and in my view, with land and resource rights. In terms of white supremacy, my question would be, if that's the dominant or one of the dominant problems, why aren't the white Russians and all the white people on the planet all working together to exploit everybody else? Why then this war between white people? Question. I love the quote from Fidel, just ideas have great power. And I want to connect that with the cognitive war, which was a new concept for me and I find very valuable. But I think the cognitive war is also ours to wage. And when you talk about the battle of the consciousness of the people, this is the battle for the ideas. So in our battle for the ideas for peace and justice, I see a primary problem is the right-left battle. That is, to me, a cognitive war of dividing us between left and right, Republican and Democrat. And often on the right, there people on the right are often not comfortable with peace people because peace people come across as left. Although there's certainly people that I know who are Republicans and who are for peace, they're not comfortable with the formal peace movement for that reason. So I want to know, Harry, or any of you, have ideas on a synthesis where we can combine the values of freedom and fairness. Freedom seems right, fairness seems left. Can we find that harmonic synthesis so we can really build a languaging and a messaging beyond the old right and the old left? Don't everybody talk at once.
Yeah, you make such important points that I feel totally inadequate to say anything in response. But I read a paper today by a friend in Committees of Correspondence who was writing about her own grassroots electoral activity in Western Pennsylvania.
I'm in Central South.
Okay, and she referred to deep canvassing, which is apparently a concept emerging in several different groups like Surge. And as I understand it, deep canvassing involves talking with people, right? Not lecturing them, not proselytizing them, but talking with them to try and understand why they think the way they do. And if there are any other ways in which, or if there are ways in which people with different perspectives can learn to live and work with each other. So, you know, that's a sort of a tactical answer, but I find it kind of compelling, very time consuming and long-term struggle, but perhaps terribly important, so that we don't define an other who's a potential enemy when they're not necessarily an enemy.
Great, thank you. Let me go to Samer. Samer M, he says. Please unmute.
Another Milwaukeean.
Hey, Harry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's Samir. Yeah. Hey, thanks, Cole. Some of the ideas were already brought up. I wanted to comment on when you said, Harry, right wing. And I'm really deeply these days thinking about how some of the right wing are what we call right wing are anti-war, are standing against war, or defending the First Amendment, because they're being targets too and silenced. So I'm moving away from this idea of right wing. I mean, when someone like Tucker Carlson with millions of people watching him gets up and talks about the hypocrisy, I've never watched him. I just see articles about what he said. And when someone like him, I think we need to start, and I'm sure a lot of the movement against mandates, maybe not the anti-vaxxers, but the anti-mandates folks are right-wing, but they're also standing against government overreach, right? But I also wanted to mention, thanks Stephen for what he brought up, because those of us who follow, I'm Arab and I follow the Arab news. I'm from Lebanon and Europe. And if we follow the news from there, and by the way, Harry, thank you very much for the presentation. If we follow the news from there, it's much worse than even what you presented. Because if we follow, for example, the presidential campaign that has started in France, if you see some of the comments, some of the right wing, it's quite scary. Not to mention the UK, most of the EU, other than Germany, who wants the Nord Stream 2 to work. It's incredible. It's so scary. You would think that the Europeans would have learned something from so many wars, such colonization, France and Mali also, and all over Europe, all over Africa. It's incredible. So this is what brings me to the, and I'm no expert, as I always tell you, Harry, you and I, when we email each other, brings me to ask, why am I seeing, and it could be just an impression, I am seeing all of this moving, everything that you described, but we're still using tactics from decades ago, the peace movement, that is. We're still using the same tactics, even though the adversaries, the pro-war, the warmongers, are spreading all over the globe. There is no Europe that's going to stand against the US. So we have a different type of atmosphere, but we're still using what seems to me same tactics from before.
Yeah, I don't know if this is useful, but I have two responses. And thanks, Samir. We'll be talking a lot about this when we return to Milwaukee. I read a recent book about Wisconsin called The Politics of Resentment, written by a University of Wisconsin professor. And she's decided she wanted to understand the political behavior and attitudes of people who did not live in Milwaukee or Madison, the red state area. And she, over a period of 3 or 4 years, had a sort of a methodology, a strategy of just going to communities. She identified about 30 communities, and she went and hung out with the people and asked people if people who had coffee at the gas station every morning, she asked if she could come and listen and talk. And she deduced from her several-year conversation that resentment was a major motivation of people outside the two clusters of big population. And that was resentment against government, state, as well as national. It was resentment against people who were state employees, who periodically would appear in rural counties to, quote, give advice. It wasn't, from her point of view, necessarily simply a racist, white supremacist reaction. Many of the communities that she visited were communities that were economically devastated. Plant closings, the one big employer in the town shuts down. And so her portrait, or my takeaway, was a sort of non-specific sense of resentment, powerlessness, anger. And I came away from the reading believing that there was some justification for it. And and this book came out, I think she did her research before the 2016 election, but perhaps it was a good predictor of the fact that Wisconsin went for Trump in 2016. And so I wonder if you could generalize from this politics of resentment, not only to US national politics, but to many other countries as well. People feeling powerlessness, alienated, kind of pissed off that they're being told what to believe and what to do, usually by people like me, an academic, or someone in a peace group. And maybe that lends itself to the second question. If there's something to the politics of resentment, what kind of tactics should we embrace, those of us who are interested in positive change, those of us who believe that war is bad and military spending is bad? And I think maybe it means that we have to go back to the drawing boards and rethink our strategy and tactics. I have a vision, this is only a part of it, but I have a vision of the ruling class, if you will, looking out the window and seeing 5, 10, 20,000 people with picket signs and saying, oh, that's no big deal, we'll just ignore them. And I think that's what we've been doing. Now, I don't have an alternative proposal, but I think, as you're suggesting, our strategy and tactics have become outmoded, and we have to revisit these questions very much. And this idea of attacking or addressing cognitive war is maybe one way to do it, or maybe Fidel's idea of being able to better articulate just ideas, whether those just ideas come out of the Marxist tradition or Adam Smith or whatever. So that's not an answer, but I think you've identified the problem.
Great, thank you. Next up is Mary and Sarah. Please unmute Mary.
Terrific presentation. I loved it, of course. And I intend to share it with some people here, here being Havana. About this question of new tactics, which I did put in the chat, but I just want to say it because ever since the 2020 election, I've been thinking about this, which is in the 2020 election, our side mobilized not just thousands, but likely millions of people to phone bank and text. And it was very effective. And people have been hard at work now for almost a year, mobilizing the volunteers that we're going to need to mobilize and text for the midterms. But not just that, since my experience of working on those elections, I've been thinking, why aren't we using those same tactics in the peace movement? Why are we not getting a hold of those same voter lists, which I looked into, and we could get them? And a nonprofit has the right to purchase them, and I found out from whom. Anyway, never mind that. But when we want to mobilize against a war or against insanity of all kinds, when we want to mobilize, say, around the nuclear ban, why aren't we getting those lists and calling all our neighbors? We could do that. It's the 21st century. And not only that, and this I haven't seen used, but why aren't we using community television? Why do we think that people sitting at home are going to look at any YouTubes other than stupid dog videos and such? We have community television stations in practically every city in town, and they're dying for programs. Why aren't we putting programs on there?
I'm not sure, Harry, if you want to answer Mary's tough questions.
They're all tough questions. I wish we could all get together over a beer and work all this stuff out, but it's very difficult. I live in West Lafayette, Indiana, and sometime in the 1990s, we started an alternative free distribution newspaper. A decade later, those of us who started this first paper were ready to retire, and another group started a newspaper, and they got tired, and now we're doing it electronically. But one of the things that I found interesting, or what I find interesting now, is that there's systematic destruction of community newspapers, and there's a literature on that as well. Financial corporations, financial investors are buying newspapers, stripping them of whatever value they have and shutting them down. And there's a handful of corporations, financial investors, and media conglomerates like Gannett, who are transforming the media landscape, at least the print media landscape. Same case could be made if we look at television. And I think it would be really interesting for us as part of our grassroots activity to revisit community journalism. And like Mary is saying, there used to be community radio stations. There used to be part of the Federal Communications Act a requirement that cable companies had to give free
It's
time.
still there.
Still there, okay.
Oh,
And-
yeah, it's still there. I can get anything I want on community television.
Yeah, great.
Dime for pro.
And we had friends up at Ithaca, New York, that ran a weekly news program of their own. They got about 20 or 30 people who produced essentially alternative news. So if we correctly assume that to move our society in a different direction is going to take a lot of time, having a media strategy, community media strategy, I think would be an important part of the mix. And we probably are, I don't know what I think about this, but we might be naive to assume that just by putting something on Facebook or Instagram, that's a positive alternative. I'm not sure it is.
I'll just speak very briefly to Mary's other question, which is why doesn't the peace movement work with voter lists? Certainly Mass Peace Action endorsed us candidates. At the last election, we endorsed 4 candidates for Congress and 1 for Senate. That was Ed Markey for re-election. And we organized people to call for them. But in truth, given our numbers and our people power, we found it more effective to call our own supporters, people who have maybe attended one webinar or come in contact with us, but are not really involved with the peace movement. And that was, all the energy we had was to call those people. So, but we certainly know where to get the lists when we have the people power to use them. Richard Wright has a follow-up question. Or another question, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm trying to find the unmute button. Okay. I had a whole bunch of stuff actually. I've been busy putting in the chat. I wanted to bring up that one of the things that that's been sort of left out of this presentation is the degree of infiltration of the military into our community. For example, way back when I was out of work, I took a temporary job at Lockheed where they were developing drones. And in spite of my sordid background, they actually let me into the room where they were drawing up drones. So I got to see it. I knew that they had like a room in between floor 2 and floor 3 that was not on the books, so to speak. So I saw it up close and personal. And I should point out, I'm down here in Austin, by the way. And one of the things that, in particular, the Chamber of Commerce is trumpeting is about 2 or 3 years ago, Austin was one of the homes, I think there's 2 or 3 others, one of the homes for the Army Futures Command, in which it's an Army, or it's a defense program for better procurement. And the other thing that they've done is and it's not talked about very much, is the Defense Initiative, what the hell is it? DIUX. And what that does is that the Pentagon directly invests in promising technologies. So that's taxpayer money that's going into, as they call it, unliquefied shares, for things like robots. And now you're starting to see these robots. I think it's in Boston General that the robots are being developed. But don't get me wrong, we have plenty of stuff down here that we're developing. And this is all ballyhooed by the Chamber of Concrete. And the Chamber of Concrete is looked upon as a good player. one of the things we should be doing is targeting the Chamber of Concrete for exactly these, these things. The other thing, okay, I'll just stop there, and I'll go back to doing chat. Bye.
Thank you, Richard.
Cole, there was one book that really blew me away by Nick Terse, and I referred to it on the PowerPoint, and I forget the title. And the first 2 or 3 pages of the book, he describes a suburban household. And in this case, the father gets up first to make breakfast and wakes the kids, and the wife gets up, and he spends 2 or 3 pages talking about what they were going to consume, from the toothpaste to the Cheerios and so on and so forth. And then he describes the military connections between all these corporations, Kellogg products and so on and so forth. And he wants to make the point, I think, that the military is deeply penetrated in virtually every aspect of our lives. I've seen short articles on the connection between the military and Hollywood, and DoD collaboration with movie producers to use military equipment and so on and so forth. I think Richard is right that if we look very carefully at our society, it's totally penetrated by military institutions, military money, and military values. And so I think we need to try and uncover all of these.
Great, thank you. Well, we've kept Harry for an hour and a half. You attendees, you did a good job of coming up with a lot of tough questions, and we've had a very stimulating discussion. It's a complicated subject. We've looked at it from many sides. So I want to thank Harry and the attendees for a stimulating evening. I want to again ask you to take action to contact decision makers about the Ukraine crisis. And whoops, that isn't it. Here we go. And I put the link in the chat again, so please fill that out while you're on the line. And secondly, I'll just mention some of our upcoming events. Tomorrow night, co-sponsoring with Code Pink, we have Resisting Attacks on Palestinian Human Rights Activists with a panel of 4 Palestinian activists and supporters, organizers. Wednesday night, we have a John Baraka talking about the Black Alliance for Peace, human rights from an anti-war and anti-imperialist perspective. And then I guess we're going into next week. There's a couple of local actions here in Salem and in Springfield, if anyone is in those towns. And then the military industrial complex and our culture, I think that's with David Swanson and a couple other people next Tuesday. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Harry. Harry, do you have a final word before we close?
Happy Valentine's Day.
We love you all. Keep at it. Keep up the good fight.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.